License and registration.
Why am I being detained?
Stay in the vehicle.
The car is parked.
License, registration, step out, don't move.
This is not a stop.
ID, now.
You're not complying. Don't touch me.
Be detained.
Stop resisting. Let go. Stop resisting.
The encounter begins not with urgency, but with ambiguity. The officer's presence is casual, procedural, and initially framed as routine enforcement. Yet from the first moments, the interaction carries a subtle imbalance, one shaped less by the alleged violation than by tone, posture, and control over space. This is not a scene defined by flashing lights and a clear stop. It is a scene defined by uncertainty, a vehicle already stationary, a driver asserting autonomy, and officers retrofitting authority onto a situation that has not yet crystallized into a lawful detention. What follows is a study in how authority asserts itself before it is fully justified, and how resistance, verbal, emotional, and symbolic, becomes the pretext that later validates force. At the outset, the officer's justification shifts. The stop is alternately framed as an equipment issue, a visibility concern, a traffic violation that allegedly occurred earlier, and then as a present motor vehicle stop, despite the car being parked. This matters. In constitutional policing, the legitimacy of an encounter hinges on clarity. Reasonable suspicion must be articulable. Probable cause must be concrete. When justifications fluctuate, it signals not evolving facts, but retroactive rationalization. The driver, sensing this instability, responds not with compliance, but with challenge. He questions the basis of the stop, asserts that he has been stationary for an extended period, and resists the officer's attempts to define the moment. This resistance is not physical at first, it is narrative. He refuses to accept the officer's version of events and insists on his own. From a policing standpoint, this is where the encounter begins to degrade, not because of danger, but because authority is being questioned. Officers are trained to control scenes. Control, however, is not the same as legality. When an officer instructs someone to remain in a vehicle, that command must be grounded in a lawful stop. When an officer demands identification, there must be a legal obligation to produce it. The transcript reveals repeated commands, layered atop one another without a clear foundation, creating confusion rather than compliance. Each command escalates the interaction not by increasing safety, but by increasing friction. The driver's language becomes aggressive, profane, and confrontational. This is often where public sympathy shifts, and where many bodycam narratives end their analysis. But profanity is not a crime. Disrespect is not resistance. Anger, even irrational anger, does not itself authorize detention. The crucial question is not whether the driver is likable, but whether the officer's authority is being lawfully exercised at each step. As the exchange continues, officers repeatedly attempt to obtain documentation, license, registration, insurance. The driver produces partial information, digital records, and explanations that are inconsistent and at times incoherent. This creates a genuine administrative problem. Operating a vehicle without valid insurance is not a trivial matter. However, the officer's handling of this issue blurs the line between enforcement and provocation. Instead of pausing the encounter to verify information through official channels, a process entirely within their control, the officers remain physically close, repeatedly engage verbally, and issue overlapping commands. The scene becomes crowded with voices. Each attempt to assert control is undermined by the next officer's interjection. The driver is told to relax, to stay still, to to retrieve documents, to stop moving, to provide proof, and to remain where he is, all within moments of each other. This is how confusion becomes leverage. When a person fails to comply with conflicting commands, non-compliance can later be framed as defiance. The driver's behavior escalates. He postures, threatens, boasts, and attempts to dominate the interaction through volume and bravado. This behavior is reckless and self-defeating, but it is also predictable. When individuals perceive that they are not being heard, they often increase intensity rather than clarity. Each outburst becomes, in the officer's eyes, further justification to tighten control. Yet tightening control is not the same as de-escalation. De-escalation requires space, time, and consistency. None of these are present. Instead, officers remain within arm's reach, continue verbal engagement, and respond to insults with continued attention. The driver is not ignored. He is engaged repeatedly. This engagement, rather than calming the situation, feeds it. The encounter becomes performative. Authority and defiance circle each other, each escalating in response to the other. The turning point approaches quietly. It is not marked by a single insult or threat, but by a shift in physical control. When the officers begin to manage the driver's access to his vehicle, particularly his keys, the encounter crosses an invisible threshold. Control of movement is control of liberty. At this moment, the interaction transitions from investigatory to custodial in all but name. The driver attempts to reclaim his keys. From his perspective, this is an assertion of ownership and autonomy. From the officer's perspective, it is interference. This is the precise moment where legal clarity becomes essential and where it is most absent. If the driver is being detained, he must be informed. If he is not, the seizure of his property raises constitutional questions. Instead of clarifying the status of the detention, officers issue more commands. Stop moving, calm down. Think about it. Breathe. These phrases, while superficially conciliatory, are delivered alongside physical positioning that communicates the opposite. Hands are on the subject. Space is restricted. Options are narrowed. When physical contact begins in earnest, it is framed as a response to noncompliance. But noncompliance with what exactly? A lawful arrest? A temporary detention? An investigatory stop? The transcript does not show a clear announcement of arrest prior to force. This omission matters. The legality of force is inseparable from the legality of the detention itself. Once force is introduced, everything accelerates. The driver resists, not necessarily by attacking, but by tensing, pulling away, and continuing to argue. Officers interpret this as active resistance. Additional units engage. Voices rise. The scene becomes kinetic and chaotic. At this stage, the outcome is inevitable. The system has committed to a path that can only end in arrest. It is important to note what is absent here: a clear reset. No officer decisively steps back to redefine the encounter. No one creates distance. No one articulates calmly and definitively what is happening and why. Instead, the interaction spirals, driven by momentum rather than judgment. This is how minor enforcement encounters turn into major incidents, not through a single bad decision, but through a cascade of small ones. A command issued too quickly, a justification offered too late, a tone that prioritizes dominance over clarity. Each choice narrows the range of peaceful outcomes. The driver's later conduct, threats, insults, spitting, and continued aggression will dominate the official narrative. Charges will be stacked. The body cam footage will be cited as evidence of hostility. And in many respects, that narrative will be accurate. The driver's behavior is indefensible. But accuracy is not completeness. What the footage also shows is how institutional habits shape outcomes. Officers are conditioned to maintain command presence, to avoid appearing weak, and to respond to disrespect with firmness. These instincts, while understandable, can become liabilities when they override procedural discipline. Authority does not require escalation to be effective. In fact, escalation often undermines it. By the time the driver is restrained, the original issues, insurance status, registration discrepancies, alleged traffic violations, are almost irrelevant. The encounter is no longer about compliance with traffic law. It is about restoring control after it has been publicly challenged. The system responds not to the initial violation, but to the perceived threat to its authority. This is the critical insight of the footage. And the most consequential moment is not the first insult or the loudest threat. It is the quiet decision to press forward without clarity, to manage behavior instead of legality, and to let emotion on both sides drive the encounter. In the next phase of this documentary, the focus will shift from the individual to the institution. We will examine how policy, training, and organizational culture frame these encounters long before the first officer steps out of the patrol car. We will trace how discretionary decisions compound, how legal thresholds blur under pressure, and how accountability becomes diffuse once force is justified by resistance that the system itself helped create. For now, what remains is a scene that didn't have to end this way, but almost always does when authority is asserted before it is explained. By the time the encounter moves fully into the second phase, the outcome is no longer uncertain. What remains undecided is not whether the driver will be arrested, but how completely the situation will collapse into disorder, and how the system will later explain that collapse. This is the stage where institutions reveal themselves most clearly, not in calm compliance, but in friction. Once physical control is asserted, the logic of the encounter reverses. Earlier, officers were required to justify their commands. Now the subject is required to justify his movements. Every gesture is scrutinized. Every word becomes potential evidence. The burden of explanation shifts entirely onto the individual, even as his ability to comply diminishes with each additional officer, each physical grip, each shouted command. This is where the language of policing becomes both precise and elastic. Terms like resisting, not positioning, and not complying appear repeatedly, yet their meanings remain fluid. Resistance is no longer defined by clear acts, striking, fleeing, attacking, but by failure to move in the exact way demanded, at the exact moment demanded, under conditions that make precision nearly impossible. The driver insists he is not resisting. From his perspective, this is true. He is not attempting to assault the officers. He is not attempting to escape. He is reacting physically and emotionally to being restrained without, in his mind, justification. From the officer's perspective, resistance is occurring because control has not been immediately achieved. The distinction between intentional resistance and reflexive reaction collapses. This is a critical failure point in modern policing. the inability or unwillingness to differentiate between defiance and panic, between aggression and confusion. Policy often recognizes this distinction. Practice, frequently, does not. As the officers attempt to place the driver into custody, commands multiply. Stop moving. Relax. Put your foot in. Get down. Stand up. These instructions overlap and contradict one another, delivered by different voices from different angles. Compliance becomes a moving target. Each failure to comply justifies additional force, which in turn makes compliance harder. This is how force becomes self-validating. The driver's physical distress becomes audible. He yells about pain, about his arm, about being hurt. Officers respond with a familiar refrain: he is hurting himself. This statement serves a dual purpose. It reframes responsibility away from the officers, and it converts visible distress into evidence of non-compliance. Pain is no longer a signal to pause. It is proof that the subject is doing something wrong. From an accountability standpoint, this is one of the most dangerous moments in any arrest. Once pain is attributed to the subject's own actions, officers are psychologically insulated from reassessing their tactics. The possibility that force itself may be excessive or improperly applied is implicitly dismissed. Meanwhile, the original legal issues, insurance verification, registration status, have disappeared entirely. The encounter is now governed by criminal procedure rather than traffic enforcement. Charges accumulate rapidly: obstruction, resisting, assaultive behavior, later aggravated by alleged bodily fluid contact. Each charge is layered atop the last, not as a response to new threats, but as a narrative structure that explains why force escalated. This is not accidental. Charging decisions often function as retrospective justification. The more chaotic the arrest, the more serious the charges must appear to explain it. The driver continues to speak, angrily, incoherently, defiantly. He references prior encounters, alleges targeting, invokes race, and oscillates between bravado and grievance. None of this helps him. But it is also not irrelevant. These statements reveal something essential about how repeated low-level encounters with law enforcement can reshape perception. To the driver, this is not an isolated incident. It is a continuation of a pattern in which he feels singled out, disrespected, and powerless. Whether that perception is accurate is almost beside the point. What matters is that policing does not occur in a vacuum. Every encounter carries the weight of those that came before it. When officers dismiss claims of targeting outright, rather than acknowledging perception while maintaining boundaries, they reinforce the very narrative they seek to refute. Inside the patrol car, the power dynamic is complete. The driver is restrained, enclosed, and physically subordinate. Yet the confrontation does not end. Verbal conflict continues, now filtered through the barriers of custody. This is often where professionalism is most tested and most likely to fail. Officers respond to insults with sarcasm. The driver mocks the situation, alternately taunting and lamenting. Neither side disengages. And the encounter remains emotionally charged long after any operational necessity has passed. This prolongation matters. Every additional exchange increases the likelihood of further allegations, further charges, further complications. At the jail, the pattern continues. The driver's behavior remains erratic and provocative. He admits to spitting, qualifies apologies, reframes actions, and continues to assert that he has been wronged. From a legal standpoint, much of this is deeply damaging to his own case. From an analytical standpoint, it illustrates how custody does not automatically restore order, especially when the underlying conflict was never resolved, only overpowered. The officers, now supported by institutional space and hierarchy, regain composure. Their language becomes more procedural. The chaos of the street gives way to the routines of intake. This transition itself is telling. It suggests that the earlier volatility was not inevitable but situational, driven by environment, proximity, and unresolved authority struggles. One of the most revealing moments comes not in aggression, but in attempted dialogue. A supervising figure listens, acknowledges emotion, and attempts to explain. This belated effort at communication contrasts sharply with the earlier phases of the encounter. It raises an uncomfortable question. Why now? Why does explanation become possible only after force has been applied? The answer lies in risk. On the street, officers perceive risk to control and safety. In custody, that risk diminishes. Only then does the system feel safe enough to slow down, to listen, to contextualize. But by then, the damage is done. Injuries have occurred, charges have been filed, trust has been eroded beyond repair. The driver articulates a sense of inevitability, that he is going to jail for a reason now, that if he is being treated like a criminal, he may as well become one. This fatalism is one of the most corrosive byproducts of aggressive enforcement. When individuals believe outcomes are predetermined, incentives for compliance evaporate. Rational behavior gives way to expressive behavior. The encounter becomes symbolic rather than practical. From a policy perspective, this is exactly what community policing strategies aim to prevent. Yet here, the system reinforces it. The driver's past interactions are referenced. His history is known. This knowledge, rather than encouraging caution, appears to harden positions. Familiarity breeds contempt, not understanding. It is important to resist simplistic conclusions. This is not a story of innocent victim versus villainous officers, nor of heroic restraint versus criminal chaos. It is a story of misalignment between policy and practice, between legal thresholds and emotional responses, between authority as a concept and authority as an experience. The officers are not operating outside the system. They are operating exactly as the system has shaped them. They prioritize control. They interpret defiance as threat. They escalate incrementally, each step justified by the last. By the time force is used, it feels unavoidable, not because it was legally required, but because no alternative path remains visible. The driver, likewise, is not acting in a vacuum. His behavior is self-sabotaging, aggressive, and destructive. But it is also shaped by a belief, earned or not, that compliance will not protect him, that explanation will not help, and that respect will not be reciprocated. In that mindset, confrontation becomes a form of agency. This convergence is where accountability narratives often fail. They focus on the final act, the arrest, the force, the charges, without examining the conditions that made those acts feel necessary to the participants. True accountability requires tracing the chain backward, identifying not just errors but assumptions. In the final part of this documentary, the focus will widen further. We will examine how incidents like this are processed after the fact, through reports, charging decisions, internal reviews, and public narratives. We will explore how responsibility becomes diffused, how lessons are rarely institutionalized, and how similar encounters continue to unfold across jurisdictions with striking consistency. What remains after the shouting fades and the paperwork begins is a question the system rarely asks itself. Not whether force was justified in the moment it was used, but why that moment was allowed to arrive at all. By the time the encounter reaches its final stage, the outcome has already been formalized. The paperwork will reflect a sequence of offenses. The reports will describe escalating resistance. The video will be cited as corroboration. What remains unresolved is not the disposition of the case, but the meaning of the incident itself and how the system will metabolize it. This is where accountability either begins or quietly disappears. In post-incident narratives, causality often flows in one direction. The subject was uncooperative, therefore force was used. The subject resisted, therefore charges were added. The subject made threats, therefore heightened control was necessary. Each step appears logical when viewed in isolation. Together, they form a closed loop in which the system's actions are always reactive, never initiating. What this framing obscures is the role of discretion. Every stage of the encounter is shaped by choices that are technically permissible but not inevitable. The decision to engage rather than disengage. The decision to remain physically close rather than create space. The decision to argue rather than clarify. These are not violations of policy. They are expressions of culture. Police culture places immense value on command presence. Officers are trained implicitly and explicitly that losing control of an interaction is dangerous, both physically and symbolically. Being challenged publicly, especially in front of peers or on camera, is experienced not merely as disrespect, but as a threat to authority itself. In that environment, de-escalation can feel like surrender. This incident demonstrates how that mindset narrows options. Once the driver refuses to accept the officer's narrative of the stop, the interaction becomes adversarial. Rather than resolving the dispute through verification and distance, the officers attempt to impose compliance through proximity and repetition. Each failed command reinforces the perception that control is slipping, which in turn justifies stronger measures. After the arrest, institutional processes take over. Charges are listed. The subject's prior history is referenced. His statements during custody are contextualized as further evidence of instability and hostility. The initial ambiguity of the stop fades into irrelevance. The question of whether the detention was clearly articulated becomes secondary to the fact that resistance occurred. This is a crucial mechanism of institutional self-protection. When resistance is present, earlier procedural uncertainties are rarely scrutinized. Courts, review boards, and internal affairs units tend to focus on the moment force was applied, not the moments that made force likely. The presence of aggressive behavior acts as a solvent, dissolving earlier concerns about justification. The driver's own conduct ensures this outcome. His threats, insults, and admissions overshadow any legitimate grievances he may have had. By the time he alleges targeting and racial bias, his credibility has been thoroughly compromised in the eyes of the system. This is not because such claims are inherently false, but because they are delivered from a position of extreme antagonism. Here lies one of the most tragic dynamics in modern policing. The individuals most likely to feel targeted are often the least able to articulate that perception in ways the system will accept. Emotional dysregulation, prior negative encounters, and a deep mistrust of authority combine to produce behavior that confirms institutional expectations rather than challenges them. When the driver says he feels he must go for a reason, he is articulating a belief that the system has already judged him. In that moment, deterrence has failed completely. The law no longer functions as a guide for behavior, only as a punishment already assumed. This is not an excuse for misconduct. It is an explanation for why misconduct persists. From the officer's perspective, the incident will likely be remembered as exhausting, but justified. They attempted to issue tickets. They offered opportunities for compliance. They tolerated abuse longer than many would. When force was used, it was in response to perceived resistance. This narrative is internally coherent and institutionally reinforced. What is missing from that narrative is reflection on alternative pathways. What if the officers had disengaged once the vehicle was confirmed parked? What if verification had been conducted from a distance? What if one officer had taken sole command of communication, reducing conflicting instructions? And these questions are rarely asked in formal reviews because they challenge not policy violations but norms. Norms are harder to address than rules. A rule can be rewritten. A norm requires cultural change. Body-worn cameras were introduced with the promise of transparency and accountability. In many respects, they have delivered. Encounters like this are no longer hidden. The public can see the chaos, the language, the escalation. But visibility alone does not guarantee understanding. Without careful analysis, footage becomes another tool for reinforcing pre-existing beliefs, either about police misconduct or about criminality. This is why documentary analysis matters. Not to inflame outrage or excuse behavior, but to slow the moment down and examine its structure. To identify where power shifted, where legality blurred, and where emotion overtook judgment. In this case, the most consequential failures are not dramatic. They are procedural and psychological. The failure to clearly articulate the nature of the stop. The failure to create physical and emotional space. The failure to disengage from verbal provocation. Each failure is small enough to seem reasonable in isolation. Together, they produce an encounter that spirals beyond anyone's control. The driver will face serious consequences. Charges related to resisting, obstruction, assault, and bodily fluids carry significant penalties. His own words and actions will be used against him. The system will move on, having processed another difficult arrest. Fine, the officers will likely face none. Their actions fall within broad discretionary boundaries. Any internal review will focus on compliance with use of force policy at the moment restraint was applied, not on the upstream decisions that made restraint likely. Training may be reinforced, but rarely reimagined. And so the cycle continues. Incidents like this persist, not because of a lack of rules, but because of a surplus of tolerance for escalation. The system accepts a wide range of officer behavior as reasonable so long as it is framed as a response to resistance. It accepts a wide range of citizen behavior as culpable once authority has been challenged. Between these two acceptances lies a narrow space for de-escalation that is seldom occupied. What this footage ultimately reveals is not a single failure, but a pattern. A pattern in which authority is asserted before it is explained. in which compliance is demanded before legitimacy is established, in which resistance becomes both the cause and the consequence of escalation. For meaningful change to occur, accountability must expand beyond outcomes. It must interrogate processes. It must ask not only whether force was justified at the moment it was used, but whether the system created conditions in which force became the default resolution. Until then, encounters like this will continue to end the same way. The details will change. The names will change. The footage will accumulate. But the structure, the quiet decisions, the compounded tensions, the irreversible shifts will remain. And in that structure lies the true story this bodycam footage tells.